There are places not marked on any map, villages whispered about but never visited, where red lanterns sway in silence and ancestral altars still drink the blood of promises made centuries ago. Welcome to FolkFear. This is not the horror of jump scares and shadows in the dark. This is the horror buried in bloodlines, the kind passed down in bone, in prayer, in silence. We bring you ghost marriages and spirit-bound daughters, cursed villages and forbidden offerings, old gods forgotten yet never gone. Each story on this channel is rooted in rural Asian folklore, China's lost funeral rites, Vietnam's ancestral debt, Thailand's haunted forests, where Taoist sorcery binds souls to objects, and betrayal never dies, it festers. So, if you hear drums in the hills, if the wedding veil is red, and if your name is written in ashes on the altar, it's already too late. You've crossed into the realm of forgotten rituals. You've entered the world of FolkFear. The rain had long since stopped, but the mist clung to the hills like a shroud. Min adjusted his satchel as he stepped off the last motorbike ride, boots sinking into the soft mud of the jungle trail. Behind him, the driver, an older man with cracked glasses and a quiet cough, refused to turn off the engine. He waved him away with shaking fingers, eyes never meeting Min's. "You shouldn't go further," the man said, voice hoarse. "They don't like strangers there." Min offered a polite smile, thanking him in northern dialect, but the man had already turned the bike around, tires spinning mud into the ferns. He disappeared down the winding slope, swallowed by jungle shadows and engine echoes. Ahead was silence, absolute and unnatural. A stone arch rose from the overgrown path like a forgotten gravestone. Moss covered its surface, but the words carved into the lintel were still visible beneath the grime. Ban San Sui, half mountain, half water. Min pulled his notebook from his jacket. He had spent the last 3 months tracking references to this place in old ethnographic records and Hakka ghost stories. Most considered it a myth, a border village tucked between the limestone cliffs of northern Vietnam and the shadows of southern China, a place where women outlived every man they married, a place whispered about in Yunnan funeral rites and found in footnotes, never maps. He ducked beneath the arch, its stone damp and cold, and stepped into the narrow pass. The world changed. Mist thickened, curling around his body like smoke. Bamboo groves creaked in the windless air. Red paper strips, some faded, others freshly inked, hung from branches like bleeding flags. He recognized the calligraphy, paper wards, talismans meant to ward off ghosts. But here, they weren't nailed to doors, they were nailed to the trees, as if the entire forest was cursed. He walked for an hour before the first sign of life appeared. A tall wooden gate blocked the path, its beams dark with rot and age. Crimson characters were painted across the lintel in broad, precise strokes. Men who enter forget who they were. Women who leave forget who they loved. Men stared at the words for a long moment, then pushed the gate open. Ban San Sui revealed itself slowly. The village was nestled in a valley, its thatched roofs hunched beneath the weight of centuries. Rice paddies glimmered in the distance, mirrored in stagnant pools that never quite reflected the sky. No power lines, no cell towers. Just rows of wooden homes, their beams carved with dragons and clouds, now cracked and brittle from time. The air smelled of damp earth, old incense, and something else, something faintly metallic, like rust or blood. As Min entered the first lane, heads turned, elderly women sitting in front of doorways fell silent. Children disappeared behind hanging cloth curtains. Men, what few there were, stared with narrowed eyes, not hostile, but wary. An old man approached him, hunched and barefoot, a gnarled cane tapping the stones. "You are here for the dead, aren't you?" Min blinked. "I am an anthropology student," he said in Vietnamese, "from Hanoi University. I'm here to study rural death rituals, ghost marriages, widow rites, ancestral offerings. I've read that Ban San Sui—" "There are no ghost stories here," the man said, cutting him off. "Only warnings ignored." The old man gestured toward a nearby house. "Speak to Madame Ya. She keeps the ledgers and the rules." Then he turned and walked away, disappearing behind a weather-worn shrine shaped like a coffin. The house was larger than the others, its walls made of stone instead of wood. Hanging above the doorway was a crimson lantern, but it wasn't made of paper. It looked like bone, carved thin and brittle, with red dye seeping from its cracks. A woman greeted him, middle-aged, hair pinned back with a wooden comb carved with the 8 trigrams. Her eyes were sharp, black like ink that never dries. "I know who you are," she said before he introduced himself. "You come looking for ghosts, but we are the ones who live with them." She didn't invite him in, not at first. Instead, she led him to the back garden, a courtyard enclosed by cracked stone walls and a single fig tree with red strings tied to every branch. Each string held a name, dozens, maybe hundreds, some written in ink, some scratched in blood. "All the men who have married into our village," she said quietly. "None of them lived long." Min stepped closer, studying the strings. Each bore 2 names, one male, one female, and a date scrawled underneath. Then he saw it. One of the names was his. Nguyen Min, Lee May, date, blank. The string was newer than the others. The ink hadn't fully dried. He felt the chill before he heard the voice behind him. "She was promised to someone else," Madame Ya whispered, "before she ever drew breath." Li Mei first appeared in the orchard. Min had returned to his small guest room. The village had no inn, only spare homes offered to rare visitors, and tried to record the day's events. But his pen refused to write. Every note bled into shapes he didn't remember drawing. Lanterns, veils, coffins, teeth. He stepped outside to clear his head and saw her. She stood beneath the fig tree, her white blouse glowing in the moonlight, sleeves fluttering like wings. Her hair was long, almost reaching her waist, tied in a red ribbon that looked too old for her youthful face. She didn't smile, didn't speak, but she didn't run either. "Li Mei?" She nodded, barely. He stepped closer. "I don't mean to intrude. I only want to understand. This place, it's unlike anywhere I've ever been." She tilted her head. "That's because no one who comes here ever really leaves." Her voice was soft, wistful, like a lullaby sung through broken teeth. "You shouldn't have looked at the strings," she said. "They remember you now." Then she walked into the trees, her figure swallowed by the mist. Min stood frozen, heart hammering against bone, and behind him the crimson lantern swayed on its hook, though no wind stirred the air. That night, Min dreamed of red. Not fire, not blood. Fabric. A veil soaked in tears in crushed magnolia, floating through a river of ashes. He saw Li Mei, but her eyes were covered and her hands were bound in silk cords. He reached for her, but something pulled her back. A man in ancestral armor, his mouth sewn shut with gold thread, holding a dagger made of jade and bone. The last thing Min saw before waking was a hand pressing ink onto skin, writing his name, not on paper, but on flesh. When he awoke, the mist had returned, thicker now, almost solid. A shape moved behind it outside his window, tall, slow, carrying a lantern that glowed like an open wound. And in the distance from the hills above the village, something began to beat, soft and slow, like the echo of a drum made of skin. It pulsed through the night like a heartbeat that didn't belong to the living. Min knew then he wasn't just observing a ritual. He was becoming part of it, whether he wanted to or not. The morning arrived without color. Mist clung to every surface like damp cloth, muting the world in shades of gray and bone. Even the roosters didn't crow. Somewhere in the village, a bamboo wind chime tapped softly, out of rhythm, like it too had forgotten the melody of waking. Min stepped outside. His skin felt damp, though it hadn't rained. A thin layer of ash dusted the courtyard stones, not the kind from fire, but the kind burned from incense and bone, the kind used in offerings for the dead. Villagers passed him with downturned faces, carrying baskets of joss paper and pale fruits wrapped in red twine. None met his gaze, not even the children. As he reached the well at the center of the village, he noticed it again. The absence. There were no birds, no dogs, not even insects. Ban San Sui was quiet in the way a tomb was quiet. He turned toward the orchard, and he saw her. Li Mei stood beneath the fig tree again, but now her hair was unbound, flowing loose over her shoulders. Her hands were pressed together in prayer, and her lips moved in silence. The morning light caught in her eyes, and for a moment, Min thought they shimmered red. He walked toward her, slow and careful, as if approaching a ghost that might vanish at any step. She didn't look up. "They remember you," she murmured. Min stopped. The strings on the tree, the names. That's not a legend. It's a ledger. Everyone who has ever been part of the Widow Lantern Rite, they're all written there. The women and the men they took. Min's voice came out rough. "What is it they remember?" Li Mei opened her eyes. "That you are not supposed to be here." Later that day, Madame Ya summoned him. He was led into a shadowed room behind her home, past a silk curtain marked with symbols he couldn't read. Not Chinese, not Han Nom, something older, pre-imperial. The kind of glyphs carved into cliffside shrines and forgotten by time. The room smelled of sandalwood and fish oil. An altar stood at the center, not a Buddhist one, not Taoist either, something more primal. It had no statue, only a smooth stone basin filled with dark water and 7 black candles that had burned down to nubs. Madame Ya sat cross-legged before it, robed in black with a sash of red silk across her chest. "You've seen her, haven't you?" Min nodded. "Li Mei, she came to me. She's not supposed to speak to outsiders, not before the rite. What rite? Madame Ya's gaze was unblinking. The widow lantern rite. Every 10 years, every first blood moon of the decade, it binds the living to the dead, to keep the village alive, to keep the ancestors fed. Her voice dropped to a whisper. There was once a warlord betrayed by his kin, his sons slaughtered, his daughters sold, his land cursed. He died swearing vengeance, not on the enemies who killed him, but on the descendants who failed to honor him. He swore he would return through their blood. Min felt the air grow colder, as if the shadows in the corners had leaned closer. And so he did. She pointed to the altar. We feed him with lanterns. We appease him with brides. Every generation, a daughter is chosen, and her husband, living or dead, is offered. He understood then. The names on the strings, they weren't memories. They were sacrifices. That night, Min wandered past the edge of the village. The moon had risen, though its face was veiled in red mist. Crickets chirped in bursts, then fell abruptly silent. The trees around him shifted unnaturally, as if they leaned inward, listening. He stopped at a shrine he hadn't noticed before. It was small, built from uneven stone, with an opening barely large enough to crawl through. A bundle of incense sticks sat unlit at its base. In front of the doorway, a bowl of uncooked rice rested beside a strip of yellow paper. Curious, men knelt down to read it. The ink was fresh. It bore a symbol he didn't recognize, and one word in Vietnamese beneath it. Hua. Promise. He didn't touch it, but as he stood, he saw movement behind the shrine. A flicker of white, a glimpse of red silk. He followed. The path led him to a smaller orchard, not fig trees this time, but starfruit and sapodilla, their branches heavy with overripe fruit that no one had picked. The air was thick with the scent of decay and sugar. And there she was, Li Mei again, but different. She wore a red veil now, long, sheer, and stained near the bottom with something darker than dust. Her hands were clasped in front of her, but her wrists were bound in red thread. Min stepped forward. "Are you a bride?" She didn't speak, only nodded. To who? Her eyes glistened. To the one who never died. Min woke in his room, heart racing. Had it been a dream? He checked his hands, his wrists. Nothing. But then he saw it. On the wooden table beside his bed, where he'd left only his notebook, now rested a small box. It was old, carved from bone and wrapped in twine. And inside, a wedding ring. Jade. Ancient. Still warm. In the days that followed, Min tried to leave the village. Every attempt failed. Paths that led to the gate twisted into new turns. Bridges that should have crossed streams now ended in rice paddies. His phone had long since lost signal. The villagers refused to speak to him. Only Li Mei still appeared, and each time she wore more red. A veil, a sash, slippers, a comb. Each visit a new piece of the bridal attire. He asked her why. She said the ancestors must be satisfied. And then she said the words that shattered him. This was never meant for you, but now it will be. One evening the sun bled crimson across the mountains. The mist thickened, and the wind began to moan like a flute played through a grave.
Men sat alone in the courtyard when he heard it, a soft tapping. He turned. Li Mei stood at the threshold. But her eyes, they were empty. The color drained, like the life behind them had been erased. She stepped forward slowly, and something dragged behind her. A string, red, tied to her finger. He followed it with his eyes. It led from her hand, out the gate, through the trees, up into the hills, where a lantern swayed in the dark. And standing beneath it was a figure, tall, still, draped in burial robes, its face hidden, its mouth sewn shut, waiting. Men collapsed that night. Madame Ya found him. She didn't call for help, didn't send for herbs. She only looked at him and said, "It has begun."
It rained the next morning, but the rain never touched the ground. The mist had thickened into something heavier, something sentient. The droplets hung in the air like pearls suspended on invisible threads, unmoving, waiting. The village roofs bled streaks of red dye, running down the sides of the walls, staining the stones with veins that pulsed in rhythm with the drums. Somewhere in the hills, a slow beating began again, a deep, hollow thump. Skin stretched over wood, a ritual heartbeat. Min woke with soil under his fingernails. He didn't remember leaving the house. His legs ached. His throat was dry and lined with ash. On the floor beside his bed was a single thread of red string, knotted at both ends. He didn't touch it, not yet. That day he wandered the village again, notebook pressed to his chest like a shield. No one greeted him. Even the elders no longer watched him with suspicion. They simply avoided him entirely, retreating behind walls and closing cloth doors without a word. The widows were busy. He noticed them gathering herbs from behind the cemetery, not for cooking, but for burning. A pungent mixture of crushed wormwood, star anise, and black garlic. Some brewed dark liquid in clay pots, stirring with bone sticks under the watchful eye of the priestess from Yunnan, who had arrived the night before, robed in purple and gold. He tried to speak to her. She only placed 2 fingers over her lips, then turned away. He found the chest by accident. It was in the home of Li Mei's family, a house larger than most but quiet, set apart near the base of the hill where the orchard ended and the grave terraces began. The outer gates were open. No one stopped him. Inside, everything smelled of cedar and mildew. Candles were lit in broad daylight, casting tall shadows on the faded portraits of ancestors that lined the walls. He stepped through silence and into her room. It was simple. A low mattress, woven bamboo mats, a lacquered mirror so old the silver had faded from behind the glass. In the corner, beneath a tattered curtain, was a wooden chest. Not ornate, not large, but locked. Wrapped in 3 loops of red thread, each tied in a bridle knot. He kneeled in front of it. The wood was smooth, not like pine or bamboo, but older. It didn't feel like it belonged here. He ran his fingers across the lid and felt the grooves of ancient carvings, faded into the grain like veins in bone. Then he heard the door. Li Mei stood in the frame, her veil lifted, her eyes hollow. "You should not be here," she said. "I'm sorry." She walked past him, sat by the chest. "This was given to me when I was born, the day of the blood moon, sealed by the priestess before me. No one is allowed to open it until the rite is complete. What's inside?" She looked up. "My husband." Min's breath caught. "But you're not married." Her lips trembled,
But no sound came. And then finally, I am. That night the dreams came back, but they were clearer now. He stood in the orchard under a rain of black petals. The fig tree had turned to ash, its branches twisted into nooses. From each branch hung a crimson lantern, each glowing with something that moved inside. Not fire, but faces. He saw his own, mouth open, screaming. And Lime stood beneath it all, her gown soaked in blood, holding the locked chest in her arms. Behind her the warlord watched. His eyes were empty holes, but his presence filled every space, every breath, every shadow. He whispered something Min could not hear, but the chest responded. It shook, rattled, and bled. He woke before dawn, heart pounding. He reached for his notebook, desperate to write, to make sense of the symbols. But instead, he found the ring. The jade wedding ring from the earlier vision, or dream, now sat beside his pillow. Except this time, it was on his finger, and it wouldn't come off. No matter how hard he pulled, his skin began to blister beneath it. Later that day, Min returned to Madame Ya. She didn't speak. She simply gestured for him to sit and lit 7 sticks of incense before the altar basin. The smoke curled in strange directions, avoiding his body, as if repelled by something inside him. She placed a cracked mirror in front of him. "Look," she said. He did, and the reflection blinked. But he hadn't. He stared into the mirror, and something stared back. Not quite him, but a version just out of step. The eyes too wide, the skin too pale, the shadow behind his shoulder moving. "You are bound now." "How?" "The ring, the name, the dreams, the blood." "What do I do?" "You survive." As night fell, Min sat outside Lime's house, unsure whether to knock, unsure if she wanted her to open the door again. But she appeared anyway, silent as always. And this time she wore the full bridal veil. No face, no eyes, no smile. She didn't speak, she only opened the door wider, and inside the chest had moved. It was now placed in the center of the room, on a stone pedestal, lit by 7 candles and 1 lantern burning red. The thread was gone, and the lock was broken. Min stepped closer. The air grew colder. The wall seemed to breathe, and the floor creaked, though he hadn't moved. He kneeled, trembling, and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in rotting silk and red lace, was a single object, a marriage contract, written in blood on human skin. Beside it, a dried umbilical cord twisted around a bone needle. And beneath it all, a doll. No, not a doll, a fetus, preserved, hairless, eyes stitched shut, mouth open in a silent scream, bound in red thread, tied to Li Mei's name and Min's in fresh ink. The lid slammed shut by itself, and Li Mei whispered behind him, "Now you understand." Outside, the drums began again, louder this time, faster. The ground pulsed, the villagers lit their lanterns, and far above, on the ridge near the terraced graves, the priestess raised her hands and cried out into the void, "He is coming! He is coming! He is coming!"
The village changed after the chest was opened. Not in obvious ways. The huts still leaned against one another like tired old bones.
The rice paddies still glimmered with silvery reflections. The mist still curled beneath the trees. But something beneath it all had shifted. It was in the way the air held still, too still, like the forest itself was holding its breath. It was in the way the shadows no longer fell where they should. And most of all, it was in the eyes of the widows, as if they had begun mourning something that hadn't yet died. Min could no longer sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he returned to the orchard. Only now, it wasn't a dream. He could feel the cold air, the broken soil beneath his feet, the pressure in his chest, as if something buried beneath the roots was calling him. Every night, the vision came closer. Every night, the warlord stood nearer. And every night, the red lanterns hanging from the branches glowed brighter, pulsing like the veins of the village itself. Li Mei was silent the next morning. She sat beneath the fig tree, red veil draped over her head like mourning silk, hands folded in her lap. Min approached her slowly. She did not look up. He sat beside her in the dirt, neither of them speaking for a long time. Then finally, in a voice softer than wind, "Do you know what happens to a man who marries a spirit bride?" Min swallowed. "No. They do not die. They are kept." That afternoon, Madame Ya summoned him to the ceremonial house, a stilted structure near the edge of the grave terraces, veiled in black cloth and carved with symbols even older than the altar basin. Inside, the priestess from Yunnan waited. Her eyes were milky, blind, but she moved as if she saw everything. She poured black tea into a cup carved from horn and offered it to him without a word. He hesitated, then drank. The visions struck, instantly. Min's body dropped to the mat, trembling as the priestess chanted in a language that scraped the edges of time. He saw flashes, salt fields, a battlefield soaked in fire, rows of severed heads, their mouths stuffed with joss paper. A warlord in crimson armor, weeping as his sons were dragged away by betrayers with dragon tattoos. His wives slaughtered, his daughters sealed in clay jars, his land burned, his name erased. Only one promise remained. He would return. Through marriage, through blood, through paper and bone. Min awoke with blood dripping from his nose. The priestess whispered one word: contract. Madame Ya showed it to him that evening. It was not inked like the others. It was carved, etched into a strip of human shoulder blade, smoothed and polished to a parchment shine. The symbols were scorched into the bone with hot needles. They told a story, not of love, but of binding, a contract of possession, a marriage between the living and the dead, written not in romance, but in obligation. One bride, one groom, one generation per decade. The bride, born beneath a red eclipse. The groom, chosen by the ring Min now wore. He tried to remove it again, pulled until his skin tore, burned his finger in the flame of a candle. Nothing. The jade refused to loosen. It pulsed like a heartbeat, matching the rhythm of the drums. He began to feel things that weren't his, memories that didn't belong to him, swordplay, betrayal, a love lost in war, and rage. a rage older than empires. That night, the widows gathered in the grave terraces. Min was told to stay away. He didn't listen. From behind the tall grass, he watched them form a circle around a stone pit carved into the hillside. Each woman held a lantern. Each one wept, but none made a sound. The priestess stepped forward, held up the bone contract, and burned it. The fire turned green. A voice screamed from beneath the earth, and from the trees something began to walk. Ghost grooms. Min saw them first as flickers, shadows with form, drifting toward the village along forgotten paths. Each one wore wedding robes, red, torn, molded into their flesh. Their hands dragged lanterns made of skulls. Their eyes glowed with ancestral fury. They were coming for the brides. Madame Ya found Min before sunrise. She handed him a cloth bundle. Inside, his old shoes, worn, damp, covered in footprints that didn't belong to him. He looked up at her. "What is this?" "You left the house last night," she said. "I didn't." She nodded. "That's what they all say." He opened the shoes. Inside the toe of the left one was a scrap of paper. His name and Li Mei's, written in blood, bound with red thread. The ink was still wet. That evening, Min confronted Li Mei. She stood in front of the mirror with her back to him, brushing her hair with slow, mechanical strokes. The chest still sat in the corner, closed but not locked. He told her everything, about the bone contract, the ghost grooms, the dreams, the ring. She didn't turn around, only whispered, "You're not marrying me. You're replacing him." Men stepped forward. "Who is he?" She turned slowly, and for the first time he saw it. Behind her eyes, another presence, older, hungrier, watching. The warlord's spirit had already begun to take hold, and she was only the vessel. "I'm sorry," she said, "but the rite must be completed. If not you, then someone else." And then he saw the altar in her room, a new one, small, built from bone, lit by red candles, and at its center 2 small dolls made of rice paper and hair, one carved in his likeness, the other headless, still waiting. Outside, the villagers lit their lanterns. The wind changed, and the hills began to moan. The wedding was coming. Not a celebration, an inheritance, a curse passed down from blood to blood, and Min's name was already written.
The village prepared for a wedding no one wanted to attend. No banners were hung, no feasts were prepared. There were no musicians, no laughter, no joyous procession. Only the slow, deliberate folding of joss paper into ghostly shapes. Only the red candles burning down to black stumps. Only the widows whispering beneath their veils as they sharpened knives that had not been used in years. Li Mei did not speak again after that night. Ming found her standing in front of the old well, staring down into its depths as if waiting for something to surface. She had stopped brushing her hair. Her eyes no longer blinked unless she remembered to. And her voice, when it came, belonged to someone else. She had begun to fade, piece by piece. Ming followed her anyway. On the 7th night since his arrival, the blood moon rose. It burned like a coal behind the clouds, casting the village in a dim red glow that made the trees look like twisted silhouettes of skeletal arms. The wedding was not announced. It was simply expected. Ming found himself dressed in ceremonial robes he didn't remember putting on, crimson with golden thread, the same pattern worn by Qing dynasty generals in funeral portraits. His hands were bound with silk cord, tied not to protect him, but to lead him. Li Mei stood across the room. She was dressed in full bridal attire now, red silk gown, red veil, red slippers. Her wrists bled where the thread had been tied too tightly. Her posture was stiff, her face hidden. But Ming could feel it. She was weeping beneath the veil, not from sorrow, but from guilt. The priestess chanted beneath her breath, pacing between them in wide, slow circles, scattering rice and ash. The widows formed a ring, each holding a lantern, but none looked at Ming directly. Their eyes stayed fixed to the ground or to the past. The drum beats began again, slower now, final. The rhythm of surrender. A small wooden altar was brought between them, and on it the bone contract, still scorched, still wet, and beside it a dagger carved from a femur, wrapped in red thread and gold foil. The priestess lifted the blade, then stopped. Something had interrupted the ritual. A scream. From outside the ceremonial house came the cry of an old woman, followed by silence. Then another scream, louder, closer, and then nothing. The wind stopped, the mist thickened, and into the room stepped the aunt, Li Mei's aunt, her face pale, eyes wide with horror. She looked at Ming, at the priestess, at Li Mei. Then she pointed a trembling finger and shouted, "He is the second curse!" The room erupted into chaos. The widows gasped. Some dropped their lanterns, which fizzled out in trails of black smoke. The priestess turned on the aunt, hissing in a language Ming could not understand. But the damage had been done. The ritual had been broken, and with it, the veil between worlds. From the rafters above, ash began to fall. From the ground, a cold wind rose, circling the altar. The bone contract curled inward, blackening, and the dagger cracked down its length. Ming felt his knees weaken as a force swept through the room, unseen but heavy, pressing down on their lungs, their bones, their thoughts. Li Mei collapsed. The priestess dragged Ming from the room, spitting curses in 3 dialects. Her nails dug into his arm, pulling him toward the rear exit that led into the orchard. The blood moon pulsed above them like an angry eye. Behind them, the ceremonial house groaned, then screamed. Not from wood, not from fire, but from voices. Dozens, hundreds. Voices that had not been heard in decades. The spirits were no longer waiting. They had come. Ming tried to speak, but his voice was trapped somewhere between his chest and his mouth. His thoughts felt fractured, like glass splintering under pressure. He saw Li Mei being carried by 2 widows, her head lolling to one side, veil slipping from her face. She looked at him once and whispered, without sound, "Leave." But there was no leaving now.
Every path out of Ban San Sui had disappeared. The jungle beyond the gate was gone, replaced by thick walls of red mist that shimmered like curtains soaked in blood. He ran anyway, back to the fig tree, to the orchard, to the place it had all begun. And that's when he saw it. The names on the tree, all of them bleeding, the ink running like veins, the strings unraveling, the bark cracking open to reveal more names beneath, ones that hadn't been written yet. And his was there again, Nguyen Ming, this time paired with no one, just an empty space, waiting. Madame Ya found him at dawn. The sky had not lightened. The blood moon still hung above them. She brought him tea and a choice. "You can finish the rite," she said, her voice quiet and hoarse, "or you can leave him to him." Ming did not answer. She placed the broken dagger in his hands. "Choose soon," she said, "before he chooses for you." That night, the mist crept into his lungs. He dreamed of a room made of bone, a wedding feast prepared for ghosts, a bride with her hands nailed to the altar, and a groom without a face. And somewhere, behind it all, a whisper, "You should never have come."
The village slept in silence, but the silence was not peace. It was suffocation. The mist no longer curled gently along the ground. It clung to rooftops like wet cloth draped over corpses. The fig trees wept sap that glistened black in the moonlight. The crimson lanterns swayed not with the wind, but with something deeper, something breathing beneath the soil. Ming no longer dreamed. Sleep brought no rest, only a blank space where memory used to live. He awoke each morning with the weight of things he had not done, but somehow remembered. Dirt under his nails, red thread knotted tightly around his fingers, a faint ringing in his ears like a distant drum heard underwater. And Li Mei no longer spoke. She sat in her room by the mirror, unmoving. Her veil was gone now, replaced by a shroud of silence. Her hair hung loose and matted, her wrists wrapped in fresh silk, her fingers twitching every so often as if trying to untie a knot that no longer existed. Ming entered quietly, unsure if she even noticed. He sat beside her. Hours passed. When she finally turned to him, her voice was dry and hollow. "Do you know what it means to be born already married?" Ming looked at her hands. She lifted one slowly, revealing a faded scar beneath her wrist, a small crescent-shaped cut, sealed long ago but never fully healed. "It was carved on the day I was born," she said. "A symbol, a name." His name, the warlord. The story came slowly. Her mother had been chosen by the last priestess, not for herself, but for the womb she carried. A daughter was required, one born on the night of eclipse, one whose blood would carry the bond forward. Li Mei had been promised before her first breath, a ghost marriage performed before she could crawl, her spirit linked to a name long buried, the contract sealed in her blood, the witness a bone effigy wrapped in her infant blanket. The villagers celebrated, a life secured, a soul preserved, a debt paid. They called it a blessing. Li Mei called it something else.
inheritance of grief. "He was a warlord once," she whispered, "but not the kind in legends, not noble, not betrayed by emperors. He was cruel. He executed his own brothers, buried his wives alive, fed servants to wild dogs to test their loyalty. When the rebellion came, the villagers handed him over to save themselves. They burned his house, but his spirit remained, refused to move on. He swore his bloodline would never escape him. He would marry every daughter born from their betrayal, even in death, especially in death." Ming felt the ring tighten on his finger. The jade burned cold now, sending a pulse into his palm that crawled up his veins like ice. "Why me?" Li Mei turned to the mirror. "Because he knows you love me, and love is a door." Ming tried to leave again that night. He waited until the lanterns dimmed, until the widows retreated behind their veils, and the priestess began her evening chants from the ceremonial house. He took only what he could carry. He ran, through the trees, past the stone gate, along the muddy trails that had led him here, and found nothing, no exit. The road had folded inward. Where paths once wound through forest and stream, now there were only fig trees, endless and whispering, their branches heavy with strings that reached for him like fingers in the dark. He turned back and returned to the village without remembering how. The priestess waited at the gate. She did not scold him, only handed him a scroll wrapped in black cloth. Inside, a map, but not of Ban San Sui. A map of the spirit boundary, a diagram of souls tethered to names, of bloodlines knotted around bones, of cursed loops repeating every generation. In the center of the map, etched in thick black ink, his name, Nguyen Ming, and beneath it, replacement vessel. Madame Ya confirmed it at dawn. The contract had failed when the warlord's previous vessel died too soon. The Rite had grown unstable. It required a new host, a living one not from the village, one whose blood was fresh and willing. Ming shook his head. "I never agreed to this." But the village had. They had known from the moment he arrived. Li Mei collapsed that evening in the orchard. Her eyes rolled back, her lips moving as if whispering to someone unseen. The widows carried her to the ceremonial house. Ming was not allowed to follow, but he watched from the edge of the terrace as they laid her on the ancestral stone, surrounded by lanterns and red thread. The chanting lasted long into the night. At one point, the fig tree in the courtyard caught fire, but burned without flame, its leaves curling inwards and turning to ash without smoke. When the chanting stopped, the lanterns went out, and Li Mei was gone. Ming ran to her house. It was empty. The chest had vanished. The altar was overturned. The dolls were gone. Only the mirror remained. And in its cracked surface, Ming saw not himself, but the warlord, smiling, waiting. He screamed, punched the glass, but the reflection did not shatter. The warlord stared back, and then blinked. The jade ring pulsed again. Ming felt it in his bones now, a heartbeat that wasn't his, and a voice soft as ash whispered from within. "The bride was never the offering. You are."
The villagers no longer looked at Ming, not out of fear, not even out of guilt, but reverence. He had become something sacred, something untouchable, something marked. They whispered as he passed, their eyes lowered, their hands pressed together in prayer. Some placed offerings on the ground where he walked, bowls of black rice, dried fish heads, strands of hair coiled in red thread. The priestess no longer avoided him. She greeted him with a bow and called him by a new name, Soul Keeper. Ming did not sleep anymore. He wandered the village at night, searching for the rhythm of his own breath. He could no longer hear it. The ring pulsed on his finger like a second heart. The mist parted when he walked through it. The lanterns flickered brighter in his presence. The spirits had begun to notice and welcome him. He returned to the orchard on the third night after Li Mei disappeared. The fig tree had been stripped of its leaves, its bark carved with new symbols. At its base, a hole had been dug, not wide enough for a grave, but deep enough to hide a body or a chest. Ming knelt before it, unsure why. Then he saw it, a stone tablet buried just beneath the roots. He brushed the soil away. Carved into the stone was a map, not of land, but of ceremony. It showed the layout of the Crimson Veil Rite, every movement, every offering, every mark. And at the center of it, a faceless groom standing beside a veiled bride, their hands bound by threads soaked in blood, and around them 7 lanterns, each containing the name of a forgotten soul. Madame Ya approached him at dusk. She no longer moved like a woman in her 80s. Her steps were swift, her voice steady. "The rite is to begin tonight," she said. "You will stand in the lantern ring. You will wear the crimson veil, and you will call him." Ming looked at her hollow. "Why me?" "Because your name was written in the bone 3 generations ago. You just didn't know it." The ceremonial house had changed. The walls were covered in red silk, woven with symbols of fire and ash. The air smelled of burning sandalwood and crushed magnolia blossoms. The altar had been moved to the center, surrounded by 7 shallow bowls filled with ink, blood, salt, teeth, hair, rice, and ash. In front of it stood the priestess, behind her the widows, and across the altar a figure cloaked in red, Li Mei. She did not move, did not speak, only breathed, slowly, as if trapped between sleep and drowning. Her hands were tied in front of her with bridle knots, her ankles bound. A red veil covered her face, but beneath it something shimmered. Her eyes, still her eyes, but fading. Ming was dressed in silence. The robe he wore was old, centuries old, embroidered with gold thread so worn it looked like dried veins. The veil he wore was lighter than silk, but clung to his skin like fog. The priestess spoke in a language forgotten by most temples. The widows began to chant. The lanterns were lit, one by one. 7 souls, 7 names, each tied to the warlord's bloodline, each waiting for reunion. Ming stood in the center, Li Mei beside him, the altar behind them. The priestess poured the ink into the bowl of salt, the blood into the bowl of ash, the teeth into the bowl of hair, the rice into the bowl of smoke. And from the mixture she drew symbols across Ming's chest, that marks burned but did not blister. She pressed the final mark to his forehead, then placed the bone dagger into his hands. He did not flinch. His hands had already begun to forget what pain was. The chants stopped. The wind died. The candles flickered. And then the veil ceremony began. Li Mei was guided forward by 2 widows. She knelt before the altar, her head bowed.
The priestess circled her 3 times, each pass marked by the beating of a drum made from deer hide and sealed with red wax. Then came Ming's turn. He stepped forward, knelt opposite her. Their hands were joined, tarot thread wrapped around their fingers, and the priestess began to speak. Not words, but names, hundreds of them. All the forgotten men who had once stood in Ming's place. Grooms offered, lives traded, spirits tethered. As the final name was spoken, the lanterns flared, the wind howled, and Li Mei lifted her head. Her veil burned away like paper, and beneath it, not her face, not fully. It was her eyes, but someone else's smile, and someone else's shadow moving behind her skin. "He is here now," she said. "He has taken his place." Ming stood. The ring pulsed once, twice, then glowed, a red light searing through the jade. The lanterns began to rise, one by one, floating, spinning, spiraling around them. Then from the altar a voice rose, not human, not spirit, something in between. The sound of teeth grinding through silk, of stone dragged across wet wood, of vows made in rage. And the voice said, "You broke the cycle. Now you will complete it." The widows fell to their knees. The priestess cried blood. Madame Ya screamed, and Li Mei reached for Ming, her fingers trembling, her lips parted. "Forgive me," she whispered, "but you were the only one who truly loved me, and that is why he chose you." The altar cracked, the air split, and from the floor beneath them came a hand, reaching, grasping, bone wrapped in red thread, searching for Ming, and finding him. The ceremony had been completed, but the veil had torn, and now nothing was sealed. Not anymore. The sun did not rise. The blood moon faded, but no light followed. The villagers walked beneath the false dawn, under a sky stained in ash. Birds had stopped calling, the fields had withered, the fig trees stood bare, their roots curling above ground like veins seeking breath, and Ban San Sui held its silence like a blade. Min awoke not in his bed, but lying face down on the ceremonial stone, naked. Thread wrapped around his wrists, symbols scrawled across his chest in blood that had dried black. The ring on his finger now glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat trapped in stone. No one came to greet him. No one came to help. He dressed in silence and walked home, but it no longer felt like his. The villagers had begun preparing for the second offering. The first was never enough. A union must be sealed by gifts, not just vows, not just sacrifice, but memory, hair, blood, bone, grief, each given willingly, each tied to the body of the new vessel. Min. He passed the well and found 7 bowls placed around its edge, one with a lock of gray hair, another with finger bones wrapped in silk, one with dried umbilical cords, and one, the last, with a strip of scalp still clinging to skin. He looked away, but it was already too late. His name had been carved into the side of each bowl, and one of them had already begun to burn. Li Mei was no longer in her house. The priestess claimed she had been taken for cleansing, but men knew better. He could feel her presence at night, not beside him, but inside him. Her voice echoed in his mind like wind through a broken flute. She spoke in fragments, apologies, warnings, memories. He began to see her past as if it were his own. The night she was bound, the first time she saw her name on the altar, the silence in her mother's eyes as she was handed over, the feel of silk soaked in pig's blood tied around her ankles, the weight of the first spirit that entered her body. Min vomited blood the morning after. He went to the orchard. It had changed. The fig tree now bore red fruit, not sweet, bitter, dense, pulsing faintly. One had fallen and cracked open. Inside, not seeds, but teeth. Human, baby teeth. 7 of them, wrapped in black hair. He stepped back and saw what the villagers had planted beneath the tree. Small wooden stakes, each bearing a name, each tied with thread and strands of hair. All offerings, all recent. He ran to the ceremonial house demanding answers. The priestess simply turned her blind eyes to him and raised one hand. "It is not for you to ask. It is for you to carry. You are the vessel now. You hold the bridge between the living and the betrayed. You are the husband and the inheritance." That night, the dreams returned. But this time, he was not in the orchard. He was deep underground, stone walls weeping, roots coiled around his limbs, the scent of rot and incense thick in the air. He saw a chamber lit by candles made of marrow. At its center, a cradle. Inside the cradle, a child made of bone and ash, and above it, Li Mei, or something wearing her skin. She held a strand of her own hair in one hand and a needle in the other. She whispered a lullaby that made his teeth ache, then pierced her finger and fed the child her blood. It opened its mouth and screamed. Min awoke with hair in his mouth, long, black, still warm. He pulled it out in handfuls. It kept coming, from his throat, from beneath his tongue, strands and strands, as if he were coughing up her memories or something worse. He collapsed on the floor, gasping, and heard the drums begin again. The villagers formed a line outside his house. One by one they entered, each carrying an offering, a lock of hair from a dead sister, a blood-soaked ribbon, a vial of menstrual blood, a necklace made of baby teeth. Min stood at the center of the room as they circled him. Madame Ya approached last. She carried a knife. She did not speak. She knelt before him, and with one swift motion sliced open her palm, then smeared the blood across his forehead. "For memory," she said, "for the first betrayal, for the last redemption." Men did not move. His body no longer felt like his own. He could feel the blood of the village inside him now, crawling beneath his skin, whispering names he did not recognize but somehow remembered. And from deep inside, the warlord stirred. The offerings pleased him, but not yet, not complete. One more needed: hair from the bride and blood from the vessel. Men wandered into the orchard again at dusk. The sky had turned a permanent shade of bruised violet. No stars, no moon, just the soft hum of drums beneath the hills. He knelt beneath the fig tree and began to dig, with bare hands, through roots and bones, until he found the chest, the same chest that once held the contract, now wrapped in a burial shroud. He opened it. Inside, Li Mei's veil, still damp with sweat, still warm, and beneath it, a single braid of her hair and a scroll sealed in wax. He broke the seal and read his own death. The scroll was a replacement contract prepared long ago, before he ever arrived. It listed his name and hers, and beside it, the price. 1 vessel, 1 womb, 1 heir. The warlord did not just want a bride. He wanted rebirth, through Min, through Li Mei, through pain, through love, through offerings of hair and blood. Min wept that night, for her, for himself, for the part of him that loved her truly, foolishly, without knowing what love in Ban San Sui really cost. He placed the veil over his face and waited for the ceremony to find him.
He no longer walked alone. Even when no one else could be seen, Min felt the presence. It didn't breathe, it didn't speak, it didn't even follow in footsteps. It simply existed, a shadow stitched to the edges of his vision, a weight behind his back, a reflection where none should be. The spirit had begun to watch him, and it never blinked. The villagers spoke in murmurs now, not prayers. They passed Min with their heads bowed low, their hands no longer pressed in greeting, but trembling. Some avoided him entirely, hiding behind lattice screens, slipping into doorways as he approached. They had given their offerings. They had fulfilled their part. But the ceremony had awakened something deeper, something that was not meant to be stirred, not even by them. The ring on his finger had begun to change. What was once smooth jade now cracked down the middle, its center glowing faintly with red light that pulsed against his skin. Each night, it grew hotter. Min tried once more to cut it off with a ritual blade left behind by the priestess. The moment metal touched stone, the blade shattered. The ring hissed, and blood poured from his palm in patterns he didn't recognize. Symbols, spirals, names. Madame Ya visited him that morning. She didn't enter the house. She stood at the threshold, barefoot in the cold, her eyes glassy with knowing. "He is almost here," she said. Min asked who. "The groom," she whispered. "Not the one who died, the one who never did." That night the spirit grew bold. Min heard footsteps that weren't his, saw lantern light flicker where no flame burned. The wind carried whispers in a dialect he did not understand. Old Hakka, guttural and wet with phlegm and weeping. At first he thought it was madness. Then he saw the mirror. It no longer showed his face, only Lime's veil drifting, hung from something above, and beneath it a figure in red, tall and rigid, standing in the corner of the room, unmoving. He turned to look. Nothing. But the mirror still showed it, watching. He smashed the mirror. The shards fell without sound, but in the reflection of each shard the figure still stood, each showing it from a different angle, each closer. Min fled the house. The orchard had grown silent. The fig tree now bore no fruit, only lanterns, red, hollow, glowing from within. Each one whispered as he passed, names he almost remembered, screams he had not heard yet. He reached the base of the tree and found a new offering, a comb, carved from bone, wrapped in black thread. He picked it up. It was still warm. The comb belonged to Lime, and her hair was still caught in its teeth. He heard her voice before he saw her, soft, broken, singing the lullaby from the dream, the one that bent the air. He followed the sound through the trees, past the graves, past the ceremonial house, to the abandoned shrine hidden behind the old cemetery walls, a structure of rotted wood and incense-caked stone forgotten by the villagers. Inside, the walls were covered in scrolls made of skin, blood-written names hanging in the dark, and in the center, Lime, but not standing, bound, hands tied with red string, eyes open but unfocused,
as if her soul had stepped out and left her body behind. Men stepped forward. She did not move, only her lips. "He is watching me," she said. "He is inside now." Min touched her wrist. The thread burned his fingers, but still he reached, untied one knot, then another, and with each knot undone, a memory returned. Her smile, her laugh, the way she used to walk barefoot along the field paths, carrying incense sticks and dried herbs, before the veil, before the spirit, before the contract. The final knot unraveled, and Li Mei collapsed into his arms. They fled the shrine together. But the air had changed, the sky had turned black, the drums had stopped, and the mist had begun to bleed. Thin streaks of red flowed through it, forming patterns in the air like veins pulsing through fog. The village was silent, too silent. Then, from the hill above the orchard, came the first lantern, not floating, carried by the spirit. It was no longer formless. It had shape now, height, hands, a face stitched in shadows, wearing Li Mei's veil like a crown. Its eyes glowed from beneath it, two holes that burned without fire, and it spoke in a voice that did not belong to this world. "The vessel has fled. The bride has betrayed. The price must be paid." Men pulled Li Mei behind him, but his feet would not move. The ring on his finger had frozen, and the spirit reached out one long arm, pointed, and 7 more lanterns began to drift forward. Behind them, the ghost grooms, men with hollow chests, mouths sewn shut, clutching wedding portraits soaked in tears, each dragging their own coffin. Men and Li Mei turned and ran, through the rice fields, into the jungle, but every path led them back. The mist curled around their steps, the soil shifted beneath their feet, and when they broke through the trees, they were back at the fig tree, at the altar, at the chest. The spirit stepped from the mist, held out the ring finger, waiting. Men fell to his knees. "I didn't agree to this," he whispered. But the spirit laughed, and the altar cracked, and the trees bled, and above them all, the sky tore open, letting something older, deeper, colder through. The one who had always been watching.
The drums returned just after midnight. They did not come from the ceremonial house, nor from any human hand. They rose from the hills, low, distant at first, like thunder heard from beneath the sea, then closer, sharper, like the beating of flesh against stretched skin, measured, ancient. Each strike sent a tremor through the ground. Each pause echoed in the bones. Min sat alone beneath the fig tree, the broken ring still clinging to his finger. Blood seeped from beneath it now, not from a wound, from the stone itself. The red mist thickened around him, curling like smoke around a lantern that refused to die. Somewhere behind the trees, something howled, but it was not an animal. It was joy. The villagers lit their lanterns again, not in celebration, in fear. They lined the roads, barefoot and pale, dressed in mourning white. Each held a folded paper talisman between their teeth, to keep the dead from speaking through them, to stop the spirits from borrowing their breath. The widows whispered prayers that had no gods, only rules. Do not meet the eyes of the red groom. Do not answer the call of your name after dark. Do not touch your reflection until morning. And above all, do not interfere with the final rite.
The priestess summoned Min at dawn. Her hands were stained black with ash. Her robes were soaked in oil. Her mouth trembled when she spoke. She said, "He has passed through the veil. He has entered the cycle. There is no time left." Min stared at her. "What happens now?" She did not answer, only handed him the final garment, a robe woven from burial shrouds, dyed red with blood drawn from 7 daughters. He put it on. It fit too well. The village square had been prepared. An altar carved from fig wood stood in the center. Candles flickered, but they gave no light. Instead, shadows gathered in corners where no walls stood. Min was led to the platform in silence. Li Mei followed. She had not spoken since the night before. She walked as if held up by string. Her veil had returned, but darker now, soaked with something that clung to her skin and whispered as it dried. They stood across from each other, not as lovers, not as strangers, but as offerings, one for blood, one for memory. The drums intensified. Min felt them inside his ribs, his spine, his throat. Each beat shook loose another piece of who he used to be. He could no longer remember the city, the university, his old life. Only the orchard remained, only the ring, only her. The priestess raised the bone staff and began to chant, not in Hakka, not in Vietnamese, in something older. Each word cracked the air like ice splitting. Each syllable echoed through the valley like a scream held for centuries. The altar glowed red. The mist opened, and the warlord arrived. He did not walk. He descended, lowered from a rift in the sky that was not sky, a tear in memory, dripping silence. He wore no face, only a veil of names, Min's name among them. He held no weapon, only a lantern carved from skull and sealed with wax. Within it, a fire that whispered, and at his side, a cradle, empty, waiting. Min stepped forward. So did Li Mei. Their hands were joined again with red thread, but this time it wasn't silk, it was sinew, still warm, still twitching. The priestess cut a lock of Min's hair, dropped it into the fire, then a lock of Li Mei's, then a strip of skin from her own arm. The flames screamed, and the warlord reached. He placed his hand on Min's chest. The ring cracked open. From inside, not light, not bone, a small scroll, no larger than a finger, sealed in blood. Min tried to back away, but the thread held him still. The priestess whispered, "You must read it, or he will never leave." Min unrolled the scroll. Inside, a vow, written in blood, the same words he'd dreamed for nights. "I take this vessel to restore what was broken. I bind his soul to mine, until memory fades, until names turn to ash, until the final breath." Min's voice cracked, but he spoke the vow aloud, and the earth answered. The altar exploded in light. The villagers fell to their knees. The widows wailed, and the warlord laughed, a sound like blades dragged across bone. Then silence, total, as if the air had vanished. And when Min opened his eyes, Li Mei was gone. In her place, a child, wrapped in red cloth, breathing, alive, not born, but shaped, not hers, not his, theirs, the warlord's rebirth. The priestess fell dead, so did Madame Ya. One by one, the widows collapsed. The lanterns burst into black flame, the fig tree split down the middle, and the child began to cry. Min stepped forward, hands trembling, heart hollow. The ring fell from his finger, shattered, and he knew the spirit had passed through, and now it was in the world again. The drums stopped, and the silence returned. Not peace, but possession.
The child did not blink, not once. Men held it in his arms, wrapped in the shroud Li Mei once wore, its skin pale as candle wax, its lips red as cut string. It weighed almost nothing, yet carrying it drained him with every step. It never cried again after the first breath. It simply watched with eyes that were not new, watched with eyes that remembered too much. The village was silent now. The priestess was gone. Her body had been consumed by the altar fire, without ash, without smoke, leaving behind only her robe and her bone staff, blackened and cracked down the center. Madame Ya had fallen in her doorway, a single red thread tied around her neck, eyes open but unseeing, mouth frozen in mid-prayer. And the widows had disappeared. No blood, no struggle, only lanterns, hundreds of them, lit all at once, flickering outside every home, waiting. Min stood in the square with the child. The red mist had begun to settle, folding itself along the rooftops like smoke that had made peace with the wind. In the stillness, he heard it. Footsteps, soft, wet, heavy, coming not from the roads, from the hills, from the graves, from the forest paths no longer marked on maps. The drums had stopped, but the lanterns had begun to walk. He saw the first figure emerge from the southern ridge. It did not walk like the living. Its legs moved, but too slowly, and yet it floated forward. It wore a tattered wedding robe. Its veil hung in shreds. It held a lantern carved from a human skull, glowing from within with a flame that hissed in a language no one alive could understand. Behind it came another, and another, a procession of ghost grooms, silent, determined, bound by the same ritual. And they were not coming for men. They were coming for the child. He backed away slowly. The child did not move, did not stir, only stared up at him, eyes wide, unblinking. Min whispered to it, though he did not know what he said. Maybe it was a prayer, maybe it was just a plea, but the child did not respond. It didn't need to, because behind him he heard a voice, soft, familiar, and no longer human. Li Mei. She stood at the edge of the square, barefoot and veiled once more. Her gown was soaked in ink or blood or something darker, but her presence was whole, alive in shape, dead in everything else. Her eyes were gone. In their place, light, pale and cold. She raised one hand. The child shifted in Min's arms, reached for her, not out of love, out of instinct, recognition. Min stepped back. The ghost grooms circled closer, their lanterns dimmed as they neared. And he understood. They were not meant to take the child. They were meant to protect it, to guide it, to escort it to where it belonged, to the ancestral womb, to the spirit that had made it possible.
to the warlord, reborn. Li Mei spoke again. "You must give him up." Men shook his head. Tears bled down his cheeks. "I loved you," he whispered. She nodded. "That's why he chose you." The child turned in his arms, placed its hand on his chest. Min gasped. His heart stopped. Not metaphorically, it simply ceased, replaced by something else. A cold rhythm, a borrowed beat, the heartbeat of the ancestor. Men fell to his knees. The ghost grooms closed in. They bowed their heads, lifted their lanterns, and began to chant. Not in words, in breath, in rhythm, in history. Names forgotten, fathers erased, blood denied, all of them returned now, all of them present, all of them watching. Li Mei stepped forward, lifted the child. It did not cry. It did not smile. It only placed one hand on her cheek. And with that, she collapsed. Not dead, freed. Her body turned to salt, her veil drifted like ash, and the ghost grooms opened the path. The lanterns walked, and she walked with them, carrying the child, toward the hills, toward the shrine, toward the place where the veil was thinnest. Min remained kneeling, no longer breathing, but not gone. His soul tethered to the ritual still unfinished, the vessel used, the promise kept, and from the trees the drums began again. But they did not echo, they whispered, not in rhythm, in names. And Min heard his name last, followed by silence, then a single phrase, soft and final. "You may now rest."
There was no mourning, only quiet. The kind of quiet left behind after a storm has passed. Not relief, not safety, but the hollow awareness that something has been taken. The lanterns had disappeared. So had the grooms. So had Li Mei. And so had the child. The village of Ban San Sui sat still beneath a bruised sky, a valley caught between breath and burial. Min remained on his knees for hours. His body no longer bled. His lungs no longer strained, but he remained. Not alive, not dead, held in place by a thread thinner than soul. The ground beneath him pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat remembered by the land itself. The altar had split in two. The boon staff cracked and blackened. The ceremonial robes scattered in the wind like dead petals. Nothing left but the name. His name. Still carved into the dirt, still fresh, still binding. He tried to rise. His muscles obeyed, but something deep in his chest refused to move. Not pain, not fear, something older, tethered. He wandered the village. It had emptied. Not in body, the villagers remained, but their eyes no longer saw him. The few who still stood moved slowly, like ghosts who had forgotten they had already died. A widow swept the steps of a house that no longer had a door. A boy placed an offering bowl before a tree with no roots. They moved out of instinct, out of habit, out of memory. But none spoke, none blinked, none breathed.
It was as if the Rite had extracted more than just one spirit. It had taken time. It had taken will. Min returned to the orchard. The fig tree had collapsed, its trunk split down the center, revealing not wood but bone, spines, skulls, teeth, grown into the earth. The roots fed on history. At the base of the tree was the chest, the original one, the one that had once held the contract, the bone doll, the fetal binding. It had been sealed again, wrapped in black thread, tied with 7 knots. But something leaked from the cracks. A hum, a whisper, a heartbeat. Min stepped toward it, kneeling slowly. The ring was gone, but he still felt it, still pulsing beneath his skin. He placed his hands on the chest. It shuddered. The thread twitched. The first knot unraveled itself. He didn't move. The second loosened. Then the third. Each thread slithered back into the soil like worms returning to the grave. When the 7th knot fell open, the lid trembled, and the chest exhaled. Inside was not what he remembered. No scroll, no contract, no doll. Only a mirror. Round, polished, cracked down the center, etched with ash and lacquered with dried blood. He lifted it and saw not his face, but hers. Li Mei, smiling, whole, alive, until she blinked and her eyes went black. Behind him the mist stirred, but this was not the mist of before. It was darker now, heavier. It crawled across the ground like fingers groping for a body to claim. And it spoke. Not in words, in memories. He heard Li Mei's voice, then the warlord's, then his own, each layered atop the other until none were distinguishable. The mirror began to bleed from its cracks, from her eyes, from his reflection. He dropped it. The mirror shattered on the soil, each shard twitching as if alive. And from the broken pieces, hands emerged, thin, bone-white, wrapped in red silk. Dozens of hands, all grasping upward, not to escape, to drag. He stumbled back, but the hands had already caught him. They held him at the ankles, the wrists, the throat, and pulled. Not downward, inward, into memory, into the contract, into the place where all vessels go. He opened his eyes and found himself in the ceremonial house once again. Except it was not the same. The walls pulsed with veins. The floor was not stone, but skin. Lanterns floated above, but they held no fire. Only eyes, watching, blinking, crying. The altar stood tall. On it, the chest, still sealed, still waiting. And seated beside it, Li Mei, clothed in mourning white, her face pale, her hands folded, her gaze hollow. She turned to him and said only one word, "Unseal." He shook his head, but his hands moved anyway. He stepped forward, unwound the threads, lifted the lid, and saw himself inside. A smaller version, curled like a child, mouth open, screaming silently, eyes wide and stitched with gold. The vessel, the air, the price. Li Mei wept without sound. "This was never meant for you," she said. "But you walked too far, you stayed too long, you loved me too deeply, and the ancestors do not forget such things. They call it devotion, they call it debt, they call it destiny." The version of him in the chest opened his eyes. Men stepped back, but it was too late. He had already been seen, and once the vessel sees itself, it can no longer leave. The lanterns dimmed. The blood on the floor thickened. The mirror shards melted into the walls, and men felt it. The unsealing of what had been bound, of what had been buried, of what had been promised. He did not scream. He did not run. He knelt before the chest, closed the lid, and whispered, "I understand." And the mist swallowed him.
The orchard was no longer part of the world. It floated in silence, suspended somewhere between dusk and memory, its boundaries erased by centuries of ritual. What remained was soil that pulsed like flesh, roots that coiled like serpents, and a sky so dark it reflected only what had already been lost. Ming opened his eyes. He was alone, but not unaccompanied. The air around him whispered in 1,000 voices, not words, but names. Names carved into the tree, names whispered through the altar, names he had spoken without knowing, and all of them belonged to him. The chest had vanished. In its place stood 7 figures, tall, veiled, dressed in the remains of ceremonial garb from forgotten dynasties. Each held a lantern made from bone. Each bore a symbol carved into their foreheads, the seal of the bound. They were the first grooms, the original vessels, men who had once loved, once chosen, once sacrificed, now reclaimed, now watching, now waiting for him. Ming stepped forward. His feet did not touch the ground, or perhaps the ground no longer recognized him. His body felt stretched, thinner than skin, as if memory had replaced matter. One of the veiled grooms stepped aside. Behind him, a path revealed itself, made of lantern light and ancestral ash. At the end of that path stood the altar. No longer broken, it had regrown, and on it, a woman, Li Mei. Her eyes were closed. Her chest rose and fell slowly, not with breath, but with song. She was singing. Ming couldn't hear it, but he felt it in his bones, in his blood, in the echo of his name. She was calling him to finish what had begun, not the ceremony, the reclamation. He approached in silence. The grooms followed, their lanterns floating behind them like moons caught in orbit. As he neared the altar, Li Mei opened her eyes. But they were no longer hers. They were the warlord's, ancient, merciless, grieving. She did not smile. She only raised a hand and gestured toward the knife. It rested beside her, wrapped in silk, carved from ivory, etched with names, so many names, including his.
Ming lifted it. It was lighter than it should have been, because it was made for him, because it belonged to him, because it always had. Li Mei did not flinch as he approached. Her wrists lay across the altar, already marked where others had cut before. She had given everything, her voice, her body, her future. Now it was his turn. The lanterns pulsed behind him. The altar thrummed. The wind held its breath. Ming pressed the blade to his palm and drew it across, slowly. Blood spilled, not red, but black, thick like oil, heavy with memory. He let it drip onto the altar, onto the names, onto her skin, onto the contract beneath them both. And the altar ignited, not fire, but light, a searing brilliance of memory and pain and inheritance. Ming fell to his knees. The groom screamed, the orchard convulsed, and Li Mei wept, not from sorrow, but from release. The warlord's presence burst from her chest like breath held too long, a shadow of enormous size, clad in centuries of rage. He hovered over the altar, gaze fixed on Ming, and he spoke without lips. "You have honored the vow." Ming could not answer. He had no voice left, but his blood answered for him. The warlord raised a hand. The lanterns extinguished, the grooms collapsed, the orchard split apart, and beneath the altar a gate opened, spiraling down into the earth. The warlord descended, not as a curse, not as a tyrant, but as something finally appeased. He had been witnessed, he had been remembered, he had been reclaimed. The altar cracked, the altar crumbled, and Li Mei opened her eyes once more. This time, they were hers, truly hers. She sat up slowly as if waking from a long sickness. Ming was no longer bleeding. His hand bore no wound. His face bore no name. The ring was gone. The thread was cut. The warlord had taken everything he was owed and left. They sat in silence beside the dying altar, not touching, not crying, only breathing, for the first time, freely. But it would not last, because the debt had been paid, but not erased. The curse had not been broken, only transferred. The ancestors do not forget, they only wait. At sunrise, the village reappeared, whole again, still silent, but different. The widows returned to their porches. The trees bore fruit once more. The mist receded into the hills, and no one mentioned the ceremony, not ever again. But every 10 years, on the blood moon, a name is added to the string. A child is born beneath a veil, and the altar is rebuilt, in silence, in memory, in fear. Ming and Li Mei left Ban San Sui that morning. No one stopped them. No one said goodbye. They walked down the same path he had taken weeks before, but this time it led somewhere. Back to roads, back to maps, back to a world that did not know what they had done. But they knew, and so did the ancestors.
Ban San Sui is still there, no longer marked on any map, no longer remembered in books, but it exists, hidden beneath the folds of cloud and forest, where the mist returns each evening to kiss the soil and the lanterns light themselves before dusk. The village endures, but it is changed forever. There are no brides now. The last daughter born beneath the blood moon never made it to her naming day. The villagers buried her beneath the fig tree that never regrew. No strings hang from the branches anymore. No contracts are carved. No offerings are made. Not because the curse was lifted, but because no one dares awaken it again. Min never returned, not in body, not in soul. Some say they saw him once, years later, passing through a temple market on the southern border, holding the hand of a woman in white, with dark eyes and a voice like broken wind chimes. Others say he drowned in the Red River, walking into the current with thread wrapped around his wrists, smiling as he disappeared. No one knows for certain, only that when the fog comes down from the mountain, villagers still hear the faint sound of drums, and sometimes the quiet cry of a child that was never born. The ceremonial house stands empty, its doors locked, its floorboards warped by time. Yet every 10 years, someone places a bowl of black rice at its entrance. No one ever admits to doing it, but it always appears. A small offering, a small memory, a small warning. There are no weddings in Ban San Sui now. No veils, no vows, no grooms from outside the valley. The village has become a place of mourning, not loud, not public, but woven into the way the wind moves through the rooftops, into the silence between words, into the eyes of the elders who remember but no longer speak. And yet the altar still breathes, beneath the earth, beneath the stone, beneath the names. It waits, not impatiently, not cruelly, just faithfully, for the cycle to begin again. In the center of the village is a single lantern. It hangs from the remains of the fig tree, now nothing more than a brittle stump wrapped in red thread that no one dares touch. The lantern burns at all hours. No oil, no wick, only flame. And beneath it, carved in the base of the tree, are 2 names: Gwen Min, Li Mei. No dates, just a single word in the old dialect: reclaimed. When the wind is strong and the mists low, some say you can see them: a man in silence, a woman in white, walking the ridge above Ban San Sui, not as ghosts, not as gods, just as memory, waiting.